Welcome to the deep dive. I'm actually in Australia right now as you're listening.
Oh, right.
And just this past Saturday, May 3rd, 2025, the country had its federal election. It was, well, quite something to see. A real live example of political rights and freedoms in action.
Yeah, definitely. But, some listeners might be thinking, okay, Australia, Saudi Arabia, what's the point of comparing them? Like, how does that help anything change?
That's a totally fair point. And honestly, that's exactly what we want to explore in this deep dive. Our mission today is really to dig into what political rights and freedoms mean by contrasting these two, well, very different systems.
So we're looking at the recent Aussie election.
Right. And putting it up against the political setup in Saudi Arabia, which, interestingly, our source describes pretty bluntly as Ujrio e Oite.
Which translates sort of like the House of Saud's farm, but it carries this heavier implication, doesn't it? Like the ruling family just owns and controls everything, the land, the people, like private property.
Exactly. It's a strong image.
And based on the source material, the Saudi system is painted as, well, repressive, a monarchy, tyrannical, dictatorial even, where force and suppression are kind of the main tools of governance.
And it's explicitly tied to a specific religious interpretation.
Right.
The Quran and Sunnah as the foundation.
That's what the fundamental law apparently states, yeah.
Okay, so then you look at Australia. Totally different foundation. Human rights, freedoms, including political ones. And this election really showcased that. Now, look, we have to acknowledge Australia's own baggage, its history with racism, discrimination, colonization. It's definitely not perfect.
No, absolutely.
But the source does suggest there's an ongoing effort here, a stated commitment to learn from that past and, well, try to do better.
Okay, so let's unpack the Australian side first, the election itself.
Yeah, what stood out to me was the sheer number of players. It wasn't just two main parties slugging it out.
Right. You had multiple parties, big and small, and also independent candidates, all running, some even aiming for the top job, prime minister.
And then there's the whole federal system thing, which can be a bit confusing if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah, so each state kind of does its own thing, too.
Pretty much. Each state has its own government, its own elections. Like here in New South Wales, it's roughly every 4 years for the state government and the premier.
So people vote for their state leader and the federal government.
Exactly. There's a clear split in powers. State governments handle, schools, hospitals, local stuff mostly.
Well, the federal government, the prime minister's lot, they focus on the big picture stuff. National security, borders, the military, the economy, foreign affairs, that sort of thing.
Precisely. And another interesting point, federal elections here are every 3 years.
Oh, wow. That's pretty frequent.
It is. And you kind of wonder, does that short time frame maybe push politicians to actually focus on delivering for the public? Keep them a bit more honest, perhaps.
Could be. So what actually happened in this election? The results for May 3rd.
Well, the incumbent party, the Australian Labor Party, they won. So they get another 3 years in government, roughly until 2028.
And they were already in power before this?
Yep, for the previous 3 years, too.
Okay. And the main opposition?
That's the Liberal Party, often called the coalition, with their partners. They took a pretty big hit, a significant loss for them.
Right.
But it wasn't just about the big two. Smaller parties and independents also picked up seats in Parliament.
And what does that tell us? I mean, the analysis suggests something about the voters, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The source suggests that the Australian public really showed they were paying attention. They understood, or at least had a strong opinion on, the opposition's actions, their decisions, their plans. The vote reflected that assessment.
Which ties directly into this idea of freedom of expression and accountability in the Australian system.
Totally. People here generally feel free to voice their opinions, politically speaking, without constantly looking over their shoulder, worrying about being arrested or silenced or watched or dragged in for questioning.
And that applies whether you support the government or oppose it, right?
Right. Or even if you oppose the opposition.
Yeah.
It's about the issues.
But there's a key distinction made in how that freedom is generally used, isn't there? It's more about critiquing ideas and actions.
Exactly. Critiquing ideas, decisions, policies, plans. That's fair game. What's generally frowned upon, and often crosses legal lines too, is like personal attacks, inciting hatred against groups based on who they are, hate speech.
That align.
There is. And we saw accountability play out very directly. The leader of the opposition, the Liberal guy, he lost his own seat in Parliament.
Wow. So not just his party lost, he personally lost his spot.
Yep. Held it for something like 20 years, apparently.
20 years.
Yeah. And because he lost his seat, boom, he had to resign as leader of the opposition party.
That's a very direct consequence of the public's assessment then.
It really is. It shows the critical evaluation of his actions, his decisions, his plans. It had a real tangible impact on his career. Accountability in action.
Okay, so that paints a picture of the Australian system in practice, at least around this election. Now, let's pivot to the contrast, Saudi Arabia, or OEE, as the source puts it.
Yeah, it's quite the shift.
The information we have suggests a system where freedom of expression, especially dissent, is, well, severely limited. That's putting it mildly.
Because the whole foundation is different. Based on that specific interpretation of Islam, the expectation is, what? Agreement.
Pretty much. The principle seems to be hear and obey. You align with the ruling monarch and the established order. Expressing opinions is fine as long as they're the right opinions.
And if they're not, the source mentions that saying, yu yi I wu.
Go behind the sun. Yeah, it sounds almost poetic, but the meaning is chilling.
It implies you just disappear.
Right. Arrested, vanished, no one knows what happened to you. It's presented as a stark warning against stepping out of line, against opposing the monarch or their decisions.
But the source also hints that beneath the surface, things might be different.
It does. It suggests that if you took away that fear, that threat of reprisal, many people in Saudi Arabia probably would have different opinions on royal decisions. They'd want to debate policies.
And crucially, the source suggests this debate wouldn't necessarily be about attacking the monarch personally, but about the substance of the policies.
Exactly. Focusing on the impact of decisions, not just the person making them, but right now, expressing those kinds of views, even constructively.
It's incredibly risky.
Yeah. Oppression, interrogation, threats, actual harm, those are presented as very real possibilities.
Which brings us back to that crucial distinction the source emphasizes.
Right. The difference between critiquing ideas and actions versus launching personal attacks, inciting hatred, promoting violence, racism, discrimination, all that stuff.
A distinction that seems pretty well understood and practiced, for the most part, in a place like Australia.
Yes. And the source actually points out, somewhat critically, that some Saudi activists outside the country sometimes fall into that trap.
Engaging in personal attacks instead of focusing on policy.
Yeah. And sometimes even dragging irrelevant groups into it. Like the source mentions women being brought into criticisms of Mohammed bin Salman, which seems completely counterproductive.
So the argument is, keep the criticism focused, constructive.
Exactly. Focus on the ideas, the decisions, the plans that might harm society, whether it's politics or sports or travel or anything else. Keep it about the substance, not personal animosity or harmful rhetoric.
That makes sense.
And there's this sliver of hope expressed in the source, a hope that maybe this kind of respectful critique, focusing on ideas, could start small.
Like within families, close friends, even if political talk is dangerous.
Yeah. Fostering that way of discussing things, even on non-political topics, maybe that could build a foundation.
And the underlying belief is that if that responsible way of expressing disagreement becomes more common, starts in everyday life,
it could eventually ripple outwards and maybe contribute to positive political change down the line. It's a long game perspective.
Okay, so wrapping this up. The contrast is pretty stark, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Australia demonstrating a robust exercise of political rights, especially free expression with real accountability.
Compared to Saudi Arabia, where expressing dissent faces severe limits and serious potential dangers.
And that key takeaway, the importance of how we express disagreement, criticizing ideas versus attacking people or spreading hate.
Yeah, it's a vital difference.
So, maybe the question to leave you, the listener, with is this. Can cultivating a culture of respectful critique, even if it starts small, in everyday chats, non-political stuff, can that actually pave the way for wider societal and political change, especially in places with major restrictions?
It's definitely something to think about, and a challenging thought.
Indeed.
This deep dive was recorded on Wednesday, May 7th, 2025.
And as always, we wish you love, peace, and unity.